small tax cuts under the government. We're offering better tax cuts because we can afford to do so. Now, the so-called stages 2 and 3 of the government's package 1 are on the never. I mean, often to the distance.
Yep.
In some cases, 2 elections. 2 are pretty unaffordable. I mean, hundreds of billions of dollars. And 3, and certainly when I say unaffordable, Sabra, I mean, I don't know what the economy is going to be like in 2025. You don't. Josh Frydenberg doesn't,
so
if he's being honest.
So that sounds like a thumbs down.
And 3 are highly regressive. I mean, flattening the tax rate so much that a nurse pays the same tax rate as a surgeon. So no, as we weren't last year in favour of stages 2 and 3, guess what? This year, we're not in favour of stages 2 and 3 either.
So that means potentially another $140 billion over 10 years that you have to play with if you win government. What will you do with that money?
Well, a couple of points, Sabra. Firstly, the government's low-income tax cut is temporary. Their lower middle-income tax offset is temporary. Ours is permanent. So there's a difference there. We're making a longer-term commitment to tax relief for lower middle-income earners than the government. That's a big difference, and that'll be reflected in our budget bottom line. Secondly, we've outlined our commitments, our big commitments to health and education. Education, over the course of the last couple of years, and also health, but of course a big investment in health last night, which I'm sure we'll get to. And we've also outlined bigger budget surpluses. And we can do that because of the decisions that we've taken. The Liberals can't do that, but we've made difficult decisions elsewhere in the budget. We certainly can make those guarantees to the Australian people.
Now, you talked about needing a buffer should there be some sort of global economic shock. For example, what if there is a hard Brexit that triggers some sort of global downturn? What's the plan under a Labor government?
Well, Sabra, I think we could go through all sorts of scenario planning in international...
That's just an example.
It is, and, there are others. We could go through a trade war. We could go through Europe more generally. We could go through the bond market indicating a likely US recession.
But
I'm making the point to you,
and
Sabra.
I'm making the point
and I'm agreeing with you, by and large.
Yeah.
I'm agreeing with you that they're internationally uncertain times, and we can't preempt how that will play out. We can't preempt if it will play out. I think you and I are by and large agreeing with each other that it is a material risk, and therefore you need to have more buffers. Now, how and when you react depends on the circumstances, and I can't predict that. You can't predict that.
How big's the buffer then?
It would be irresponsible to predict that. Now, we need bigger budget surpluses because that's one of the few levers that the government has available to it. Of course, when Jim Chalmers and I release our budget bottom line in coming weeks, presumably, if the Prime Minister gets around to going to see the Governor-General any time soon, the size of our budget surpluses and the impact of all our decisions will be very clear to see.
At the centre of the budget reply last night was Labor's promise of $2.3 billion for cancer treatment. How effective will that be in camouflaging the message about a $200 billion hike in taxes under Labor?
With respect, Sabra, that's a particularly cynical approach. 1 in 2 Australians get cancer. And, of course, 1 in 2 of the rest of us watch somebody get cancer and deal with getting cancer. One of the things that we've looked at very closely is the out-of-cost expenses of getting cancer. Of course, in most cases, if you get cancer, you have to give up work. So your income's affected. And then you've got these expenses, which many people would just assume are covered by Medicare, which are not. 300,000 Australians a year avoid radiology because they can't afford it.
It is an impressive headline, but again...
no, with respect, Sabra, it's not an impressive headline, it's an impressive package.
We're almost out of time. The Sharif children that want to come back from Syria, what should happen?
Well, Sabra, I heard their grandmother on the ABC radio this morning, and I don't think any Australian could listen to the grandmother and not have sympathy with her, or be aware of the plight of the children and not have sympathy with them. They've been put in this situation by their parents, and I don't think Australians would have sympathy with their parents, and nor should we. But we don't politicise these matters. We don't second-guess the government's approach. This is a conundrum that many countries are facing, Western countries, how to deal with people who've gone to fight in Syria. And we give the government bipartisan support on their proposed way forward.
Chris Bowen, thanks for talking to us.
Thank you, Sabra.
And that's the Shadow Treasurer, Chris Bowen. The Prime Minister's Scott Morrison's held a media conference in Parliament, but he hasn't called the election. I'm joined now by our political reporter, Alexandra Beach. Alex, what's he done?
Sabra, he's just announced the establishment of a Royal Commission into the abuse of people with a disability, and the Prime Minister says that's going to look at all forms of violence, abuse, neglect and exploitation in all settings. He was quite emotional in giving this announcement, speaking about difficulties that a good friend of his has faced as well. But he says that they have already done consultation about terms of reference. They received 3,700 responses, and nearly a third of those came from people living with a disability, so they're confident with what they've got there. This is going to be headed up by Ronald Sackville, QC, who will be supported by 5 other commissioners, and the Prime Minister pointed out that that panel of 6 commissioners does also include people who have a lived experience of disability. And the inquiry is also going to be based in Brisbane. It's expected to run for 3 years, with the final report in the first half of 2022. This, of course, all comes after the Treasurer set aside that $500 million over 5 years in the budget for the Royal Commission, which also makes this the most expensive Royal Commission to date.
When can we expect the election campaign to get underway then?
Well, the ABC now understands the Prime Minister's not going to be making a trip to the Governor-General today, but this Royal Commission announcement is something that can't be done in caretaker mode. So this shows you perhaps that the government's clearing the decks before the campaign does get underway, which we're now thinking will probably be over this weekend.
And any idea of just what the Prime Minister will probably kick off with to start his campaign?
Well, we, of course, had the budget reply speech from Bill Shorten last night, and that's very much set the tone for the election now. We have heard the Prime Minister speaking about, not being able to trust what Bill Shorten said last night. They're going to be focusing on the Labor's tax hikes. That seems to be a lot of the tone that we're getting this morning as we start heading towards that campaign. All
right, political reporter Alexandra Beach, thank you. The grandmother of the children of killed Australian terrorist Khaled Sharoof has flown to northern Syria to meet with her grandchildren, who are now in no man's land after the collapse of ISIS. Karen Nettleton has told the ABC she is worried about all 3 grandchildren, but she is especially alarmed by the condition of the eldest. Zainab is in her late teens and is pregnant with her 3rd child. She also has shrapnel wounds and can't stand. Her grandmother fears for her and her unborn child. Reporter Dylan Welch is in northern Syria and spoke with me a short time ago. Dylan, how have you tracked down the family and where are they?
Well, me and a colleague have been speaking to Karen Nettleton for the last 4 years. In fact, when she went on 2 trips to Turkey to attempt to get her children out, we went with her to chronicle it. Neither of those trips ended well. The last one was late last year. So Karen Nettleton came home after that second trip and I think she was pretty down. And by that point, towards the end of last year and early this year, essentially Islamic State was being reduced to a tiny little rump way down in southern Syria in this small town called Baghouz. And that ended in a major offensive by US and Kurdish forces. And Karen Nettleton, by that point, and this is in March, so last month, she was feeling pretty down because she essentially thought her grandchildren were going to die in Baghouz. And then, out of nowhere, she received a message from one of the children saying that she had arrived at the Al-Hal refugee camp in the north. Essentially what had happened was a humanitarian corridor had been opened in Baghouz to allow women and children to leave. And Ms. Nettleton's children had essentially got out. So the moment Karen Nettleton heard that, she let us know that she was intending to go to Syria to try to find her kids at this camp and to somehow try to bring them home to Australia. So we again have accompanied her to Syria, and she's now in the process of talking to Kurdish officials to try to have her grandchildren released.
Dylan, the oldest teenage daughter of Khaled Sharoof is 17 years old. Zainab, that's Karen Nettleton's granddaughter. Zainab is actually 8 months pregnant, my understanding is, with her 3rd child, but she's not in a healthy state. What do you know?
Well, what Ms. Nettleton has told us is that in her communications with her granddaughter Zainab, that she's very ill, emaciated. Essentially, they were getting very little food when they were in Baghouz. In fact, my understanding is that there was basically no food towards the end. So then when they left and they were brought to the Al Hol camp, they began to get some food, but there's a whole series of diseases, stomach parasites, a whole bunch of problems at the camp. So I think their health, particularly Zainab's, still quite bad. In fact, we know that Karen Middleton has told us in the last 24 to 48 hours that Zainab has had complications with her pregnancy. So I think Ms Middleton's view now is that she needs to get her children out as soon as possible. This is something